So, a few months ago, I got a comment on the channel which required me to think about if and how I was going to draw the line on moderating. And this is a complicated subject, and I will probably never be very consistent about it. Though it is worth saying, I think highly moderated spaces are always more conducive to learning and debate. Just think about how heavily a classroom discussion is moderated. What I was not expecting was for the first comment I had to think about to be like this one, which itself raises an interesting historiographic topic I don't actually know enough about. The comment was in response to a video on images of the Buddha, and begins, according to Islamic teachings, which is not an unreasonable place to start. The terms iconic and aniconic used in the study of early Buddhist art are drawn from scholarly work on the Byzantine encounter with Islam in the late 1st millennium. The commenter then puts forward a theological argument about the wisdom of creators, capitalised here because the poster clearly means Allah, and proceeds to argue that because the Buddha failed to teach his followers to be grateful to the Creator, subsequent Buddhists experienced a spiritual loss which gave them no other choice to see Buddha as a deity and make Buddha images. It is polite, well written, and presents a coherent argument. So why did I delete the comment? Well, it's to do with the ascription of agency. Cannot ascribe agency to, that is, treat as a cause of events, a supernatural force. Nothing in history happens because of God. Any God. Historical study is essentially atheist. Just to be clear, that is not the same thing as saying historians are atheists. Top-class living historians represent all creeds. Nor is it the same as ignoring religion, which is a central component in almost all human societies. But no good historical work has a place for God or supernatural forces of any sort. And that is not some idiosyncratic personal opinion. For example, take Ranajit Guhar's set of essays, History at the Limit of World History. Guhar is the originator of the term subaltern and an important philosopher of history. In his essay, he is talking about the importance of prose. The first prose history in an Indian language by an Indian author was published in 1801, Ramran Basu's Raja Pratapaditya Charita. The distinction between writing in prose and poetic accounts was one that particularly engaged 18th century Europeans. And Guhar discusses, in this context, two of these scholars and their respective arguments for why most early literature is metrical, that is, poetic, in its form. He concludes, the beginning of poetry and prose, generally of language, was still hidden in a past beyond evidence, amongst those who believed they had found it. Vico spoke of it as a gift of God, and Condillac as a gift of nature. The latter, to my mind, stands for a considerable advance in historical thinking. It's a telling remark. Why is this quite small change a considerable advance? After all, nature is just as much an amorphous abstraction as God. In fact, probably more so, since Vico likely intended a particular version of a specific God. Yet Guhar sees the substitution, just as I would, as a huge stride, a momentous shift that is part of the series of changes that moves us from the history of the pre-modern world to the critical academic discipline which shares its name and little else today. And why, therefore, did I rule the comment which attributed Buddha images to godly causes out of bounds on a channel about history? Well, I can only really give you a partial answer, because I only know part of the answer. Before the modern academic discipline of history developed, most people writing about history were quite happy to treat divine power as a central motive force in human affairs. For example, the 16th century historian Abu Fazl routinely ascribes battlefield victories to divine assistance rather than strategic forethought, or even to divine assistance in the face of superior strategy. And he was neither alone, nor is he merely reporting the beliefs of his contemporaries. This Christian account of a battle in 8th century Spain doesn't just ascribe the victory to divine intervention, it specifically describes the mechanics of stones being turned back mid-flight by the miraculous power of shrines. Even in the 19th century, as the modern critical discipline was forming, some of its great pioneers, like Leopold von Ranke, would often ascribe some aspect of historical events to divine providence, though they were increasingly reluctant to give God any real agency in the text itself. But not today. And this is where I have to confess my ignorance. I don't really know how we got from there to here. I understand why God was ushered quietly out of the back door of history. We'll come to that in a moment. But I don't really know when or how or what the people involved thought about it as they did it, and I'm not aware of a good account of the process. I know a number of works that talk about how historical study changed in the 18th and 19th century, but none that I am aware of which really grapples with this question. Yes, humanism has something to do with it, and I could have titled this Why History is Humanist, but that would have required a deep dive into the different versions of the concept and the distinction between them and the modern, essentially religious movement. And it still isn't a complete answer. So with deep apologies, I need to leave a hole in the middle of this and move on to the question of why history is atheist. Why there is no place in our accounts for any supernatural agency. And the answer to this is actually very simple. Which supernatural force would you ascribe a historical outcome to? That is not a complicated question for a 9th century Christian chronicler or a 16th century Muslim court official. Sure, both would have been acutely aware of other religions, but they and their audience appear to have shared an unshakable faith in the truth of their own. A luxury no modern historian could take for granted. So what to do? Argue for a supernatural agency 90% of your audience doesn't think exists? Or write a different version of the history for each sect or denomination who might read it? Neither of those sounds like satisfactory solutions. For most historians, they would be entirely unacceptable. After all, only one thing actually happened. Even if you don't exactly know what that one thing was. Even those postmodern theorists who throw doubt on that idea understand that history depends on the assumption of a singular object of study for its coherence. They call that single thing the referent. The past is full of people who have believed in a bewildering, contradictory, and essentially infinite parade of spiritual, magical, and divine powers. But as important as studying those beliefs is, none of them have a place in historical explanation, because that needs a single reference point. And in our modern, culturally diverse world, the natural world, shorn of all powers the pious attribute to the objects of their personal religious devotion, that natural world is the reference point history needs to make sense. And that is why that comment had to go. There are certain questions you cannot ask, certain answers you cannot give, because without constraint, without the discipline of an academic discipline, without being very specific in your study, you are not really studying anything at all.